A desperate single mother buys a crumbling hotel for $5,000, hoping only for shelter. But behind one sealed door lies a secret untouched for 40 years, a secret worth $180 million, and a moral choice that could rewrite history. Before we begin, if stories about courage, justice, and hidden fortunes inspire you, please subscribe and turn on the bell. Your support helps us share more true cinematic stories like this one. Soft piano music fades in. The tone is reflective yet heavy with suspense. The rain fell in slow, steady sheets against the courthouse windows, turning the small Pennsylvania town into a blur of gray and silver. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed above rows of empty wooden benches. The smell of wet coats, dust, and old paper hung in the air. Sarah Chun stood near the back, her palms damp, clutching a worn leather envelope filled with crumpled bills. Every dollar she'd saved from 3 years of double shifts at the machine shop lay inside, $4,812. All she had left in the world. It wasn't supposed to come to this. She had promised herself that she would never let desperation make her reckless. But desperation changes shape over time. It creeps in quietly, wearing down the edges of reason until a wild idea starts to feel like salvation. For Sarah, that salvation had a name: the Grandview Hotel. An old, decaying structure that towered over Elm Street like a ghost of forgotten wealth. Once, it had hosted politicians, artists, and socialites. Now, its windows were boarded, its roof caved in, and its name barely legible beneath vines that had swallowed its walls. No one had lived there for 40 years. Rumors called it haunted. Locals said people went inside and never came out. But Sarah didn't believe in curses, only opportunities that others were too afraid to take. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the courtroom. Next item: the Grandview Hotel, 5 stories, located at 111 Elm Street. Starting bid: $5,000. The words felt like lightning striking somewhere deep inside her chest. 5,000. She had almost enough. Almost. Her heart pounded. Her daughter's face flickered in her mind. Emma, 7 years old, asleep on a thin mattress in their tiny studio apartment above a liquor store. The walls there smelled of mildew. The sound of shouting neighbors kept them awake most night. Last week, Emma had asked if they could paint the walls pink someday. Sarah didn't have the heart to tell her the landlord wouldn't even fix the leak. If she could win this building, even just the first floor, it could be theirs. A roof that no one could take away. A fresh start. The room fell silent. No one raised a paddle. Everyone knew the hotel's reputation: collapsing floors, mold, infestations. The city had been trying to get rid of it for years. And yet, in the quiet, something inside Sarah moved. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. $4,812, she said softly, her voice barely audible. Heads turned. A few people chuckled. The auctioneer frowned, tapping his clipboard. "Ma'am, the minimum is $5,000. Sarah swallowed hard. "That's everything I have." The room shifted uncomfortably. The clerk whispered something to the auctioneer. The man hesitated, glanced around at the nearly empty room, and sighed. Going once, going twice. Sarah's breath caught. Sold. Her knees nearly buckled. The room faded around her. The murmurs, the pitying stares, the rain against the glass. She had just bought an abandoned hotel. Not because she was brave, but because she was desperate. Hours later, she stood with Emma in front of the Grandview Hotel. The building loomed above them, 5 stories of fading grandeur. Broken windows reflected the dying light of afternoon. Ivy crawled up the sides like green veins reclaiming the brick. Emma's small fingers clutched hers tightly. "Is this our new home, Mama?" Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "It will be." The wind carried the scent of wet grass and rust. The sky above them was clearing, streaks of gold piercing through gray. In that moment, Sarah didn't see ruin. She saw possibility. She imagined the marble floors polished again, the grand staircase repaired, the faded sign above the door shining once more. She imagined turning each room into something meaningful, not luxury suites, but homes. Real homes for people like her. She pushed open the door. It groaned like an old wound reopening. Dust exploded into the sunlight as they stepped inside. The lobby still held echoes of its former beauty, a chandelier hanging crooked, a marble front desk layered in grime, columns that had survived time's decay. Her footsteps echoed across the empty floor like whispers from another era. That first night, they camped in what had once been the manager's office. Sarah laid out blankets, lit a small lantern, and sat beside Emma as the child fell asleep under the hum of distant rain. She should have been terrified. The building creaked with every gust of wind, the shadows seemed alive, and the loneliness pressed against her chest like a weight. But she wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, the roof above her head was hers. Outside, the storm eased. A faint glow from the town's streetlights flickered through the broken windows. Sarah leaned against the wall, exhaustion washing over her. She thought about her mother's wedding ring, the one she had sold to make up the last few $100s. She thought about every night she'd come home from work too tired to cook, every morning she'd promised Emma that things would get better. Now they finally might. The sound of rain softened into silence. And somewhere, deep in the building, a faint creak echoed, a slow, deliberate sound, like a door shifting on its own. Sarah froze. Her eyes traced the darkness beyond the hallway. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw something, a shimmer of movement, a shadow that didn't belong. But when she blinked, it was gone. She shook her head, exhaling a shaky laugh. Old buildings, she whispered to herself. They always talk. Still, as she drifted into uneasy sleep beside her daughter, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Grand View Hotel was alive, watching, waiting. And somewhere, behind a sealed door on a floor no one had visited in 40 years, something was waiting for her. Morning sunlight streamed through the broken windows of the Grand View Hotel, casting long golden beams across cracked marble floors. Dust floated in the air like ghostly snow. For the first time, Sarah felt the weight of what she had bought, a building not just broken, but forgotten by time itself. She stood at the center of the lobby, holding a steaming mug of instant coffee, surveying her kingdom of decay. The chandelier above her tilted at a dangerous angle. Half the tiles on the floor were missing. The grand staircase creaked under its own weight, its railing wrapped in cobwebs. But to Sarah it was beautiful. Every imperfection was a promise, something she could fix, something she could reclaim. She spent that first week learning the rhythm of the building, which boards groaned in warning, which pipes still worked, which rooms were safe enough to sleep in. By the 7th day, she had running water in one bathroom and partial electricity from a tangled extension cord she'd rigged up to a generator out back. Each morning, she'd walk Emma to school, then return with her hair tied back, gloves on, sleeves rolled up, a soldier against entropy. The work was brutal. Rusted nails tore at her hands. Broken glass bit at her shoes. But she didn't stop. Every wall she scrubbed clean, every window she unboarded, felt like breathing life back into something that had been suffocating for decades. Yet, amid her progress, the building began to whisper its secrets. It started with strange inconsistencies, an extra door in a hallway that didn't appear on the blueprints, a faint vibration in the floor above, though she knew no one else was there. And then, on the 10th day, she noticed something she couldn't explain. She was inspecting the old elevator shaft when she realized the numbering didn't make sense. The hotel was supposed to have 5 floors, basement, lobby, and 3 above. But the elevator's dial had a button for 6. The number had been painted over, barely visible under layers of grime. But it was there. Faded. Hidden. Sarah frowned. She climbed the stairwell to the top floor, expecting it to end at the 5th landing. But tucked behind a maintenance door was something she hadn't seen before, a narrow, spiral set of service stairs leading upward into darkness. The air there was different, colder, still, as though the building itself held its breath. At the top stood a heavy door of dark oak, its brass handle dull with age. Faded letters were carved into the wood, private and no entry. Chains wrapped tightly around the handles, secured with an old industrial padlock. Rust had eaten deep into the metal, but the structure was solid. Whoever sealed it hadn't wanted anyone inside. Sarah's heart beat faster. It wasn't uncommon for old hotels to close off wings, sometimes for safety, sometimes to cut maintenance costs. But the way this door was locked felt intentional, like someone had wanted it forgotten. She tried to pull the chain. It didn't budge. Peering through the keyhole, she saw nothing, only darkness. But something about that silence unsettled her. When she returned to her makeshift office that evening, she couldn't stop thinking about it. As the days passed, the thought gnawed at her mind like a loose thread she couldn't leave alone. Every creak in the walls, every whisper of wind through the vents seemed to come from above. Sometimes, late at night, she swore she heard a faint hum from the direction of the 6th floor, a low, mechanical vibration, steady and unnatural. Once, she climbed up again with her flashlight, pressing her ear to the wood. There, the faintest sound. Like air moving through ducts. Like machines. Impossible. The hotel had no power to that level. She stepped back, staring at the padlock, her breath clouding in the cold air. "What are you hiding?" she whispered to the door. When she turned to leave, she thought she saw something on the floor, a small, metallic glint beneath the dust. She bent down, brushing it away with her glove. It was a key tag, tarnished but still legible. Room 601. There shouldn't have been a room 601. That night, Sarah barely slept. The generator outside rattled against the silence. The building moaned softly, its pipes and beams settling. But underneath it all, she could swear she heard something else, the faint hum of air vents coming from the ceiling above her. When dawn finally arrived, she looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Circles under her eyes, dust in her hair, resolve hardened into something fierce. If there really was a hidden floor, it could mean danger, structural instability, asbestos, maybe even an old crime scene. But it could also mean something else. Something valuable. She had risked everything for this building. She wasn't about to let a locked door stop her now. That morning, she drove into town and returned with bolt cutters, a crowbar, and a length of rope. She placed them carefully beside the staircase, her tools of defiance. For now, she would focus on Emma, on getting her to school, on finishing the plumbing in the second-floor bathrooms. But the decision was already made. That door would not stay closed. By the time the sun set, the building glowed with amber light through broken panes. Sarah stood at the bottom of the stairwell, staring up into the shadows that led to the sealed floor. The silence up there was different tonight, heavier, charged. She picked up the bolt cutters and tested their weight in her hand. Soon, she promised herself. Just a few more days. But in the stillness, something faint and cold slipped through the air, a whisper that might have been wind, or memory, or something far older than both. And as the shadows deepened, it almost sounded like the building exhaled. The 11th night arrived with an unnerving stillness, the kind that makes even the air feel watchful. Outside, fog rolled down from the hills, curling around the cracked windows of the Grand View Hotel like pale smoke. Inside, Sarah Chen stood at the base of the service stairwell, the bolt cutters heavy in her trembling hands. This was it, the moment she had been circling for days. The moment between fear and revelation. The entire building seemed to hold its breath. The chains had rusted together like arteries turned to stone. The padlock was swollen with age, orange and brittle. She raised the cutters and squeezed. Once, twice. A sound like bones snapping echoed through the stairwell. The chains fell away, clattering against the steps. For a long moment she couldn't move. She half expected alarms to go off, or for the door itself to resist, to fight back. But it didn't. It only waited. She wrapped her fingers around the cold handle and pulled. The door opened with a slow, aching groan, releasing a breath of air that didn't belong to this decade. Dust didn't spill out. The air wasn't stale or suffocating. It was clean, filtered, cold. That was the first sign something was wrong. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a pristine hallway lined with rich wallpaper, untouched, vibrant, as though time had politely stepped aside and waited here. The carpets beneath her boots were immaculate. No debris. No decay. Not even dust. It made no sense. The entire hotel below her was crumbling, eaten alive by rot and neglect. But here, the air hummed faintly with electricity. A low, steady vibration ran through the walls. Somewhere nearby, hidden fans whispered. She stepped forward. Each footfall sank softly into carpet that shouldn't still exist. At the end of the corridor, 2 double doors stood slightly ajar. Gold-plated handles. Frosted glass etched with a delicate letter H. The Penthouse. Her hand hovered near the door, trembling. The flashlight beam quivered across the glass, revealing faint silhouettes beyond, furniture, frames, something metallic catching the light. She pushed the doors open. And the world changed. The room beyond stretched wide and silent, bathed in the pale blue light of hidden fixtures still humming after 40 years. Velvet curtains hung perfectly, their folds unbroken by dust. A grand piano stood near the terrace doors, keys gleaming like ivory teeth. And the walls were covered in paintings. Not prints, not reproductions, but canvases alive with color and texture. Brushstrokes that pulsed under the light. Names etched on tiny plaques below each frame, names that made her heart stutter. Monet, Vermeer, Picasso, dozens of them, each sealed behind glass panels that gleamed under their own temperature-controlled light. Sarah moved closer, her breath catching. It couldn't be real. But the closer she looked, the more impossible it became to deny. The texture of the oils, the fine cracks in the varnish, the way the light danced over them, it was all authentic. These were masterpieces that belonged in museums, not in a forgotten hotel attic. Her flashlight drifted across sculptures displayed on marble pedestals, bronzes and busts, Greek, Roman, modernist. Each piece more valuable than the last. The room wasn't just beautiful, it was sacred. Then she noticed the faint sound again, a soft hum. It came from vents near the ceiling. The air was dry, perfectly controlled, cool as a vault. And in that moment she understood. This wasn't decay. This was preservation. Someone had turned the entire floor into a time capsule, an invisible museum hidden from the world. Her knees went weak. She sank onto a velvet armchair, clutching the flashlight like an anchor. Her mind spun in disbelief. Who would do this? Why here? And how had it stayed powered all these years? As her eyes adjusted, she noticed a desk at the far end of the room. On it sat a leather-bound book, an old fountain pen, and a single yellowed envelope. The envelope was addressed in elegant handwriting, "To whoever finally opens this door." Her pulse quickened. She set down the flashlight and picked it up carefully. The paper was brittle but intact. The seal had already loosened with age. Inside was a letter written on faded hotel stationery, neat, deliberate, haunted. She began to read. "My name is Vincent Harrington. By the time you read this, I will be long gone. What you see around you is both my greatest sin and my final act of redemption." Sarah's hands trembled. In 1979, I was hired to transport stolen artworks, masterpieces looted during the Second World War. Paintings torn from the walls of families who never made it out of the camp. I was young, greedy, and desperate. I told myself I was just a driver. But when I learned the truth, I couldn't deliver them. So I hid them here. I told my employers the truck had been hijacked. They searched for me for years. I changed my name, fled the state, but I could never face what I'd done. These paintings do not belong to me. They belong to the dead, and to the descendants who still wonder what became of their heritage. I preserved them the only way I knew how: climate control, separate power source, a trust to pay the bills until the year 2025. I prayed someone better than me would find them when the time was right. Someone brave enough to do what I couldn't. Sarah lowered the page, her eyes wet. The hum of the machines seemed louder now, like a chorus of ghosts whispering through the vents. She opened the drawer of the desk. Inside was a thick ledger, filled with photographs, provenance documents, family names. Each entry meticulously labeled. She recognized one immediately: Rosenberg Collection. Another, Rothschild Archives. Names she'd heard in documentaries, in history books. Families wiped from existence, their legacies scattered by war. Her mind reeled. She had bought this building to escape poverty, to build a home for her daughter. And here she was, sitting in a room filled with enough art to buy 1,000 lives of luxury. But each frame, each brushstroke, carried something heavier than gold. The weight of loss, the echo of theft, the ghosts of those who never returned. As the last light of day faded through the penthouse windows, Sarah sat in silence, the letter trembling in her hands. Below her, the rest of the hotel remained dark, silent, unaware. Up here, surrounded by the relics of history's cruelty and beauty intertwined, Sarah Chun understood that she hadn't just found a treasure. She had found a test, and how she answered it would define not only her future, but the redemption of a man long dead. Morning crept slowly over the hills of Millbrook, spilling pale gold light through the broken windows of the Grand View Hotel. Down in the lobby, everything remained as Sarah had left it: the scattered tools, the generator's faint hum, the dust still suspended in air. But on the 6th floor, where time itself had stopped, Sarah Chun sat at the mahogany desk. The letter from Vincent Harrington open before her. The ink, faded with age, carried the weight of a dead man's conscience. She had read it again and again through the night, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. This wasn't just history. It was a confession, a lifetime of guilt sealed inside a room that should never have existed. Harrington's words told a story darker than any myth about the hotel. A story of greed, fear, and an act of redemption buried beneath 40 years of silence. He had been young once, desperate, reckless, like her. But unlike her, his desperation had cost lives. And now, decades later, his cowardice had found her. The ledger lay open beside the letter, a book of ghosts. Every page documented a piece of humanity stolen and hidden: the Rosenberg Collection, the Blum instruments, the Goldstein portraits, photographs of smiling families who never came home. It wasn't just art. It was identity, heritage, memory. Sarah closed her eyes, her fingers brushing the edge of a painting nearest the desk. A small landscape by Claude Monet, delicate strokes of water lilies glowing faintly in the artificial light. If she sold just this one piece, she thought, it could change everything. A single painting could buy a home, pay for Emma's education, erase every debt, every sleepless night spent wondering how to afford tomorrow. But as quickly as the thought came, shame followed it. These weren't hers to sell. Each canvas represented lives destroyed, families whose only traces now existed in oil and pigment. To take even one would be to continue the theft Harrington had begun. She rose and paced across the silent penthouse, her boots whispering across carpet that had defied time. The hum of the climate systems pulsed like a heartbeat, steady, unending, almost alive. The man who built this vault had done so not for greed, but for redemption. To protect what he once stole. To give someone, someday, a chance to do what he could not. That someone was her. And she didn't know if she was strong enough. Her thoughts spiraled through memories. Emma sleeping beside her in the freezing studio apartment. The night they ate canned soup by candlelight when the power was cut. The feeling of walking home from double shifts with blistered hands and an empty wallet. Was it wrong to want a better life for her child? Wouldn't any mother take it, if fate placed fortune at her feet? But then she remembered the faces in the ledger, black and white photographs of mothers just like her, whose lives had been erased by war, whose names were reduced to captions under museum records. And in that moment, Sarah realized something profound. The fortune in this room was not hers to claim, it was hers to return. She sat back at the desk and lifted the final page of Harrington's letter. To the one who finds this, it read, I cannot undo what I've done. But you can. There is a ledger here. Names, families, records. Return them. Let beauty serve justice. Let my failure become your courage. Tears blurred her vision. The words felt like a plea, one soul reaching through time to another. The air around her felt heavy, thick with memory. She imagined Harrington sealing the door 40 years ago, hearing the chains clink shut, knowing he would never see the world again. His secret had slept until she came along. Now it was awake. The question was what she would do with it. By the time dawn reached the penthouse windows, Sarah had made her choice. She carefully refolded the letter and placed it back on the desk. Then she reached for her phone, her hand trembling not from fear, but from clarity. She scrolled through her contacts, hesitating only a second before searching. Holocaust Museum, Washington, D.C. Her thumb hovered over the number. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. Tired eyes, dirt-streaked skin, a woman who had fought her whole life for scraps of stability. She looked nothing like a hero. But maybe heroes didn't look like heroes. Maybe they were just people who refused to let history repeat itself. She pressed call. The line rang once, twice. A voice answered. Sarah's voice was calm, steady, almost detached. The voice of someone who had already accepted what she had to do. I found something, she said quietly. Something you've been looking for. Her words disappeared into the static. And with that call, history shifted. Downstairs, the hotel was silent. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the cracked street and the first glow of morning sun. Sarah stood by the terrace windows, staring out at the town that had long forgotten her. She thought of Emma, still asleep in the tiny room below, unaware that her mother had just changed both of their lives forever. For once, Sarah didn't feel desperate. She felt right. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was how that one act of courage would set off a chain reaction that would shake the world, rewrite history books, and awaken a town that had slept as long as the paintings themselves. The world didn't change with thunder or fanfare. It changed with a single phone call, a tired woman's trembling voice saying the words, "I found something." When Sarah hung up, the hotel felt different. The air itself seemed charged, like a storm waiting to break. She looked around the penthouse, the priceless art glinting under the pale morning sun, and felt an eerie calm. It was over. The secret no longer belonged to her alone. By noon, the first call came back. The Holocaust Museum's director, a woman named Catherine Walsh. Her voice was professional, careful, almost disbelieving. Sarah described everything. The sealed floor, the climate control, the letter, the ledger. There was a long silence on the other end. Then only 3 words, "Don't touch anything." The following 48 hours unfolded like something from a dream. Unmarked vans arrived first, then state police cruisers, then black SUVs with federal plates. Yellow tape unfurled across the front steps of the Grand View Hotel. The building that no one had cared about for decades suddenly pulsed with the weight of history. Sarah stood in the lobby, clutching Emma's hand, as men in suits and gloves carried equipment up the stairwell. Cameras flashed outside. Reporters swarmed the street, shouting questions that blurred together. Did you really buy it for $5,000? How much is it worth? Are you keeping the art? Sarah didn't answer any of them. She barely spoke at all. All she could do was watch as strangers in white gloves entered the place she'd begun to call home and began removing her discovery piece by piece. Inside the penthouse, everything was methodical, catalogued, photographed, sealed. Each painting was placed into temperature-controlled crates, each sculpture wrapped like a relic from another world. Names like Vermeer, Monet, Picasso floated in hushed voices as though they were sacred prayers. The FBI confirmed it. Every piece had been reported missing between 1942 and 1945. The world's museums had long believed them destroyed, burned in bombings or lost to time. But they had been here, above an empty town, in the custody of one man's guilt, and now, in the care of one woman's courage. When Director Catherine Walsh finally arrived, she found Sarah standing near the old front desk, still in her work clothes, dust streaked across her jeans. The woman approached gently, almost reverently. "Ms. Chen," she said, "you have no idea what you've done." Sarah braced for reprimand, expecting to hear about legal consequences, ownership disputes, investigations. But instead, Catherine continued, "You've facilitated the largest recovery of Holocaust-era stolen art in modern history. The combined value exceeds $180 million. But more importantly," she paused, looking toward the ceiling, toward the sealed floor that had once held so much sorrow, "you've given lost families back their stories." Sarah said nothing. She simply nodded, her throat tight, eyes glistening. For decades, the Grand View Hotel had been a symbol of failure, a decaying monument to greed and neglect. Now it was something else, a shrine of restoration, a living museum of redemption. News spread like wildfire. Within a day, every major outlet in the country carried the story. Single mother buys abandoned hotel, discovers $180 million in lost art. The headlines grew more dramatic by the hour. But beneath the sensationalism was something purer, a quiet awe that one ordinary woman had chosen integrity over fortune. The museum's experts worked around the clock. They confirmed the authenticity of each piece, tracing its origins through wartime archives and old European family record. And as each painting story was uncovered, the world began to weep. The Rosenberg Monet, stolen from a Paris apartment in 1942. The Goldstein Vermeer, looted from a Vienna townhouse the same year. The Blum bronze, missing since the fall of Warsaw. Each artifact was more than art, it was testimony. Soon, descendants of the victims began to come forward, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, families who had spent their lives searching for these lost pieces of themselves. The first to arrive was an elderly woman named Ruth Goldsteinmeier. She stood in the lobby, frail but determined, holding an old photograph. In it, a young girl sat beneath a painting of a cottage, the same painting now resting safely in a museum crate. "I was 6, she whispered to the agents beside her. "That was in my mother's music room." Sarah watched from a distance, her heart breaking and healing all at once. She hadn't just found treasure. She had found closure, for people she'd never met. Over the next week, more families came, the Blums, the Hermans, the Kaplans. Each reunion filled the air with quiet tears and laughter, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the relief. The once silent hotel became a place of reunion, its corridors echoing with gratitude instead of ghosts. For Sarah, the attention was overwhelming. Media vans still parked along the curb, the world still called her a hero, but she didn't feel like one. She had only done what she knew was right. And yet, in that choice, she had changed everything. At night, when the crews left and the lights dimmed, Sarah would sit in the lobby, watching Emma sleep curled up on a blanket. Outside, cameras flashed. Inside, the air felt sacred, filled with history, redemption, and peace. Her phone buzzed constantly, calls from lawyers, museums, reporters. But one message, one name, stood out from the rest. Michael Rothschild. A philanthropist, a descendant of one of the families listed in the ledger. His message was brief. 3 of those paintings were ours. I would like to meet you in person. Sarah put the phone down and stared at the ceiling, at the floor above where it had all begun. The air was quiet again, but not empty. For the first time since she'd bought the hotel, she felt something new rising inside her. Not fear, not exhaustion. Something like purpose. She didn't know it yet, but the next person who would walk through her door would change her life again, in a way she never could have imagined. Music swells, a mix of strings and piano, hopeful yet heavy. The secret was out. The world had noticed. But fate wasn't done with Sarah Chin yet. Millbrook had always been a quiet place, a town of 8,000 people where nothing ever changed, where the biggest news was a new stoplight or a high school victory. But after Sarah Chen's discovery, quiet became impossible. In a matter of weeks, the town that had long ignored the decaying Grand View Hotel now pulsed with movement. News trucks lined the curb, reporters filled the diners, and tourists with cameras wandered Elm Street just to glimpse the building that had held the world's hidden art. Yet, when the chaos faded, what remained was something unexpected: pride. For decades, Millbrook had been known for decline: closed factories, empty storefronts, people leaving rather than staying. But now, the story was different. A single mother had done something extraordinary. She had found not just lost paintings, but a reason for the town to believe again. Inside the hotel, Sarah watched it all unfold from her office, once the old manager's quarters, now cleaned and bright. Emma colored quietly at a nearby desk. The hum of renovation filled the air, the steady rhythm of rebirth. Contractors came first, funded by government grants and donations from museums. Electricians rewired the old circuit. Painters restored the faded walls. Plumbers fixed pipes that hadn't carried water in decades. But it wasn't just professionals who showed up. One morning, Sarah came downstairs to find Margaret from the hardware store, the same woman who had once called her crazy for buying the place, standing in the lobby with a box of tools. "Heard you're fixing this up yourself," she said bluntly. "Figured you could use some help." A few days later, the Kowalski brothers, local contractors who'd never given Sarah the time of day, arrived with a truckload of leftover lumber. Then came the volunteers. Teenagers after school, retired men who wanted to paint, mothers who brought sandwiches for workers. Bit by bit, Millbrook began to heal. What had started as Sarah's act of conscience was becoming something much larger: a shared redemption. The FBI and museum staff finished their work, and the art was shipped to Washington. The penthouse was left empty again, silent except for the steady hum of the climate system still running, the last breath of Vincent Harrington's secret. Sarah stood there one night, alone in the cleared space. The walls that had once held stolen masterpieces were now bare, ghostly rectangles where frames had hung. She felt grief and gratitude intermingled. The beauty was gone, but its meaning remained. That's when she heard a knock downstairs. It was evening, the streets outside quiet, the fog rolling in again. She descended the staircase and found a tall man in a gray coat standing at the lobby door. He was older, kind-eyed, with a gentle gravity that filled the room before he even spoke. "Ms. Chen," he asked. "I'm Michael Rothschild." Sarah froze. She recognized his name instantly. He was a philanthropist, a billionaire known for restoring historical sites and funding humanitarian work. But in that moment, he looked like anyone else: tired, humble, grateful. He explained that 3 of the recovered paintings had belonged to his family. His grandfather had hidden them before fleeing Europe. For decades, the Rothschild descendants had searched, hoping, praying. And now, because of her, they were home. Sarah didn't know what to say. Gratitude wasn't enough. Michael smiled softly. "You returned something that money couldn't buy," he said. "Now, I'd like to return the favor." He walked slowly through the half-repaired lobby, studying the cracked marble, the broken chandeliers, the scaffolding stretching into the stairwell. "What are your plans for this place?" he asked. Sarah laughed quietly, exhaustion in her eyes. "Plans? I can barely afford the roof. I just wanted a safe place for my daughter. Now, I don't even know." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe I can help you figure it out." He told her about his family's foundation, one focused on community rebuilding and historical preservation. Her story, he said, had inspired him more than any project he'd ever funded. He wanted to restore the Grand View completely, not as a hotel, but as a living monument to redemption. Together, they would create something new: affordable housing for families, community spaces for children, and on the top floor, a small museum dedicated to the hidden art and the power of doing what's right. Sarah was speechless. The offer didn't feel like charity. It felt like purpose. Over the following weeks, papers were signed, funds transferred, and blueprints drawn. But more importantly, Millbrook rallied. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years began working side by side. Local carpenters rebuilt staircases. High school students repainted walls. Retired veterans repaired the garden out front, planting flowers where weeds had grown. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about meaning. The story that had started as a global sensation was becoming something far quieter, a community reborn through kindness. Emma had her own room now, painted lavender, with a small desk by the window. For the first time in her life, she could fall asleep without hearing shouting through the walls. At night, Sarah would peek in and find her daughter reading under a lamp, her face peaceful, her world finally stable. Sometimes, Sarah would walk the halls and listen, to the laughter of volunteers, to the hammering of nails, to the distant hum of renewal. The Grandview Hotel, once cursed, was now alive. But her favorite sound came from the penthouse. One afternoon, she stood there as workers installed new glass panels and lighting fixtures for the future exhibit. The air still carried Harrington's presence, that quiet plea for redemption. Sarah ran her hand across the smooth wall and whispered softly, "You did it, Vincent. You saved them. You saved all of us." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling golden light across the hotel's facade. For the first time in 4 decades, the Grandview glowed. The same building that had once hidden stolen beauty was now filled with something purer, the kind of beauty that grows from forgiveness, from second chances, from unity. And for Sarah, it was the first time in years that she no longer felt like a survivor. She felt like a builder. 18 months had passed since the day Sarah Chen lifted the bolt cutters and opened that sealed door. In that time, everything changed. The woman who had once bought a crumbling hotel with her last $4,812 now stood at the center of a miracle. The Grandview Hotel had been reborn. The decaying structure that had haunted Millbrook for decades now glistened beneath the autumn sun, its Art Deco lines restored, its cracked glass replaced, its once broken heart beating again. The paint was fresh, a soft shade of cream and gold that caught the light like morning dew. Flower beds lined the walkway. Children's laughter drifted from open windows. Inside, the lobby shimmered with life. The marble floors, once dulled by decades of grime, now reflected the glow of chandeliers newly hung. Wooden pillars gleamed with polish. Banners hung from the staircase railings. Grand reopening, a new chapter for Millbrook. The crowd was larger than the building had seen in generations. Reporters, townspeople, families from across the country, all gathered to celebrate the resurrection of a place that had once symbolized decay. And at the center of it all stood Sarah, wearing a simple navy dress, her hands trembling slightly as she held Emma's hand. Her daughter had grown taller. Her eyes, bright and curious, scanned the crowd, the journalists, the museum curators, the town volunteers who had become family. It was more than a reopening. It was a homecoming. Sarah stepped onto the small wooden stage in the lobby. The hum of the crowd softened into silence. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "I bought this building because I was desperate," she began. "I had a daughter who deserved better than a moldy apartment, and I thought I was just buying walls and a roof." Her gaze moved across the room, the faces of neighbors, workers, and strangers whose lives had intertwined through this improbable story. But buildings aren't just walls. They're stories. This one hid a dark secret, a secret that became a chance for healing. A hush settled over the crowd. Cameras clicked softly, but no one moved. When I opened that sealed door, I thought I'd found treasure. But what I really found was truth and a choice. Doing the right thing isn't about reward. It's about recognizing that some things matter more than money. Her voice cracked slightly. She glanced at Emma, who stood just beside her, smiling with pride. "This place isn't mine anymore. It belongs to all of us, to the families who need homes, to the children who need safe spaces, to the people who believe that light can always return where darkness once lived." Applause erupted. Hesitant at first, then building, wave after wave, until the sound filled every corner of the newly restored lobby. The chandeliers trembled above them, the light scattering like confetti. Tears streamed down Sarah's cheeks as she smiled through them, overwhelmed, humbled, radiant. When the applause faded, she looked up toward the grand staircase, toward the 6th floor that had started everything. There, behind glass, visitors could already see the small museum she'd built with the Rothschild Foundation and the Holocaust Museum, the Vincent Harrington Gallery of Hidden Histories. Inside were photographs of the recovered art, replicas of the paintings, and the original letter, framed under soft light, Harrington's words immortalized. "Let beauty serve justice. Let my failure become your courage." The same climate control systems that had once protected stolen art now preserved stories, pictures of reunited families, letters of gratitude, and testimonies from the descendants whose lives had been touched. The building itself had become a living timeline, from greed to guilt to grace. After her speech, Sarah stepped down and was immediately surrounded by people. Volunteers hugged her. Children handed her flowers. Reporters pushed forward with microphones, but this time, she wasn't nervous. She was grounded, a woman who had walked through ruin and found her way to light. Michael Rothschild approached, his smile kind and proud. "You did it," he said simply. Sarah shook her head. "We did it." He nodded. "Then let's make sure it never falls again." Over the next hours, the lobby filled with music and celebration. Local musicians played on the grand staircase. Families toured the museum. Children ran laughing through the hallways that once smelled of dust and decay. Emma tugged her mother's hand and led her outside. The setting sun painted the building gold, and for the first time, Sarah saw it, not as it had been, but as it was always meant to be. A beacon. She thought of that first night in the rain, standing in front of the hotel with nothing but a few dollars and a dream. She remembered the cold floors, the fear, the darkness. And now, she saw all of it replaced by warmth and color and life. Emma looked up, eyes wide. "Mama, we made it beautiful again." Sarah smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "We really did." As dusk settled over Millbrook, the Grand View's windows glowed from within, each light a story reborn, each room a promise kept. For generations, it had been a monument to loss. Now it was a monument to hope. Music swells, full orchestra, strings and choir rising like sunlight through clouds. And somewhere, in that quiet hour between day and night, Sarah could almost feel Vincent Harrington's presence, not haunting, but at peace. The man who once hid beauty out of shame had finally seen it brought into the light. And the woman who once sought a home had built one for an entire community. 3 years had passed since the Grand View Hotel opened its doors again. What had once been a ruin was now a landmark, not of wealth, but of worth. Every corner of the building told a story. Children played in the courtyard gardens where weeds had once grown. Elderly residents sat on benches, reading under sunlight that filtered through newly restored stained-glass windows. Laughter echoed through the halls, blending with the quiet sounds of daily life. Footsteps, conversation, music from the community center on the ground floor. And at the center of it all was Sarah Chin. The same woman who had once counted crumpled bills in a courthouse now stood in her office on the 2nd floor, surrounded by framed photographs, black and white portraits of the families whose art she had returned. On her desk sat a single letter, its edges worn from being read too many times. "You didn't just return paintings," it read, "you returned pieces of our souls." It was signed by Leora Rosenberg, a teenage descendant of one of the families, writing from Jerusalem. Sarah ran her fingers over the words, smiling softly. Outside her window, Emma, now 10 years old, chased a group of children across the lawn, her laughter rising through the open glass. The sight filled Sarah's chest with a quiet joy that words could never touch. Her phone buzzed. A text from Michael Rothschild. Foundation-approved expansion. Construction begins next month. Community clinic confirmed. Sarah exhaled slowly, gratitude washing over her. The hotel wasn't just surviving. It was growing, evolving into something far greater than she had ever dreamed. The 1st floor now held a daycare and after-school program. The second, a small library and computer lab. The upper floors provided affordable housing for families who had nowhere else to go. And on the top floor, the penthouse that had once sealed away sorrow, stood the Vincent Harrington Memorial Gallery. It was no longer a place of secrecy. It was a place of light. Visitors came from all over, historians, students, families, travelers. They walked among displays of photographs, digital archives, and short films about art lost and found. Every wall whispered a single message: redemption is possible. That morning, a young reporter from a documentary team arrived. She was new, eager, and carried a microphone like it was fragile. She asked if she could film a short interview with Sarah for a feature called "The Woman Who Gave It All Back." Sarah smiled politely and agreed. They walked together to the penthouse gallery. The reporter adjusted her camera, then asked softly, "Ms. Chin, people call you a hero. You gave up a fortune. Do you ever regret it?" Sarah looked around the room. The quiet light, the photographs of reunited families, the laughter echoing faintly from the courtyard below. She shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "Because I didn't lose a fortune. I found one." The reporter smiled, but pressed gently. "What do you mean by that?" Sarah turned toward one of the framed letters on the wall, Harrington's original confession, now preserved behind glass. "There's an old saying," she began softly, "that when you save one life, you save the world. I think that's true for history too. When you protect what was stolen, when you make something right, you're saving the world in pieces, one truth at a time." The reporter lowered her camera slightly, listening. "Money disappears," Sarah continued. "But integrity, that stays. It passes from one person to the next. My daughter will grow up knowing that doing what's right matters more than what's easy. That's a fortune no amount of wealth can replace." She smiled gently, her eyes glistening in the golden light filtering through the windows. The reporter nodded, moved, and ended the recording. But Sarah lingered in the silence that followed, letting the stillness wash over her. Outside, Millbrook thrived like never before. The hotel had become its heart, a place where people came not to forget the past, but to learn from it. There was a community kitchen now, where neighbors of all backgrounds cooked and shared meals together. A veterans program offered work and housing to those who had fallen through society's cracks. And every Friday night, the courtyard filled with families, music, laughter, light. The same building that had once hidden stolen art now created something priceless every day: connection. As dusk approached, Sarah walked up to the terrace, the very same terrace where she had once stood trembling, holding Harrington's letter. Now, the view stretched wide and bright, the town alive below, the sun painting the sky in deep shades of amber and rose. Emma joined her, holding 2 cups of hot cocoa. The child handed one to her mother and leaned against her shoulder. "Mama," she said softly, "do you think the man who hid those paintings knows what you did?" Sarah smiled faintly. "I think he does," she whispered. "And I think he's proud." They stood together in silence as the last light faded, the stars slowly emerging above the restored Grand View Hotel. And in that stillness, it was clear. The story had never been about wealth. It had been about restoration. A man had hidden art to preserve its beauty. A woman had uncovered it to restore its truth. And together, across decades, through guilt and grace, they had created something enduring. The building that had once sealed darkness now radiated warmth across an entire community. The hotel's lights glowed softly, their reflections spilling across the wet cobblestones like scattered gold. Sarah Churn had not inherited riches. She had inherited meaning. And through her, so had everyone who entered those doors. Music rises. Soft choir, cinematic strings swelling into resolution. Because sometimes, the most valuable treasures aren't the ones locked away, they're the ones you give back.